Hi, I'm Gary Hoag, and in this video, we're going to look at growing in generosity. Now, even the topic is something we've got to understand from a biblical perspective. And so I want to give you some background. When I was doing my PhD in England, every time I cited the scriptures, I was required by the school to cite them in the New Revised Standard Version. And so I actually picked up this copy of the New Testament, which has become my favorite Bible, because it has the Greek on one side and the New Revised Standard Version on the other. Now you say, well, what's that have to do with growing in generosity? Well, I'm reading in my Bible, and it says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity. So I look up the Greek word agathosune, and you know what I discover? Generosity is when humans start giving in like heavenly ways. So, for example, we tend to be a container of God's material blessings. And when generosity happens, when agathosune happens, when the Spirit of God's at work in us, instead of being a container of material resources, we become a conduit of those resources. And so I started to say to myself, well, how do I, as a minister, want to help you and your church grow in the grace of giving, grow in generosity? And so, you know what I realized? To go from being a container to a conduit, we've got to remove the plug, if you will. We've got to get the flow happening. We've got to get generosity in gear. And so what I've come to realize is there's a number of shifts that we need to help followers of Christ make to help them grow in the grace of giving. And the shifts are from what I would call cultural patterns to biblical practices. Cultural patterns to biblical practices. And so I'm going to give you 10 of them. And so the first one is from law to love. Our motivation for giving shifts in Christ. We don't have to give like it's the law, like, okay, you have to give this much. We get to give because of God's love shown to us. And when we give motivated by love, we imitate God, because it says, for God so loved the world that he gave. And so out of love, we get to give. 1 Corinthians 13:3 tells us, you can give like everything you have to the poor, but if you don't have love, it's worthless. So Christian giving must be like accompanied, must include love. It's got to include love. And yet that's just the beginning. So we've got to shift from law to love in our giving. The second shift we've got to make is from merit to mercy. Merit is, I'm going to give to the people I think deserve it. And mercy is giving to the most undeserving person. So I want you to close your eyes and imagine the most undeserving person. You ready? If you give to that person, that's generosity. Because God, when we were undeserving, gave to us. So when we give to the undeserving, our giving, our generosity looks just like Christ. And if you read Luke 6:27-36, it pretty much says, if you give to like your friends, what good is that? But when you give to the undeserving, when you show mercy, it's like you'll be called children of the Most High. That's Christian generosity. So our giving should be love, not law, mercy, not merit. Let's go to the third one. Third shift is fairness, not favoritism. So if we go from favoritism is, I'm going to give to the things I care about. And we do that. We give to the things we care about. Fairness is, I'm going to distribute God's resources to the things God cares about. So in other words, when we see the Christians are starving in Jerusalem, and what do God's people do in the Apostle Paul tells the people in Corinth, your extra is going to supply their not enough, and that brings equality. So when there's a need, God's people share, because this is what they do. It's fairness, it's equality. It's not forced, it's willing to make sure that everyone has enough. So our giving is characterized by this fairness, this justice, rather than favoritism. The fourth shift, really important, is from percentage to proportionate giving. This is really important because I'll give you my testimony. When I came to faith in Jesus, I was what I would call a percentage giver. I thought, oh, I'm supposed to tithe, so I gave a tenth, and then I became kind of prideful that I did that. And then I thought the other 90% was mine to do as I please. And you know what I realized? Well, first, I became just like the Pharisees, who in Luke 16 are described as these greedy lovers of money, because they were prideful being prideful for tithing. And so what I would encourage you to do is don't think, how much of my money do I give to God? It's actually Richard Foster who reminds us we should ask, how much of God's money do I need to keep for myself? And so if God blesses us a lot, we get to give a lot. And so giving in the New Testament is measured according to our ability, not by some percentage in the law. And so Acts 11:29 and 2 Corinthians 8:2 and 3 remind us that according to our ability, we get to participate in God's work. And Randy Alcorn says, God blesses us not to raise our standard of living, but our standard of giving. And so I challenge people each year, how can you stretch and give proportionately, similar to or based on what God's given you? Next is point number 5 is from dependency to distributor, from dependency to distributor. In Mark chapter 6:38, or in Mark 6, Jesus is going to feed the 5,000. And he tells the disciples, hey, I want you to feed the people. And the people are like, or the disciples are like, well, Jesus, it would take a half year's wages to feed those people. So their focus was on what they didn't have. And Jesus says, well, what do you have? Go and see. And they had 5 loaves and 2 fish. And so when that was given, when we give God what we have, when that was given, Jesus broke it and there's enough for everyone. And so acceptable giving is based on what God's given us. And so instead of, and by the way, I'll share a video with you called Palm Full of Maize from Malawi, where this vision is spreading, where people who are used to saying, well, we don't have enough. And when their attitude is focusing on what they don't have, it puts you in a place of dependency. When you look at what you do have and you give God what you do have, you become this distributor and you always have enough. And what's interesting is 2 Corinthians 8:12 says, the gift is acceptable, not based on what a person doesn't have, but what they do have. So to be a distributor of what you have, to joyfully enjoy and share what you have, 1 Timothy 6:17-19, we look like Jesus and we become these generous people. So move from dependency to distributor. Next, we're going to go to surplus and move beyond surplus giving to sacrificial giving. Now, you say, wow, this is really stretching me. And the answer is yes. These shifts are moving us from cultural patterns, which is, I'm going to give the leftovers, the surplus, to I'm going to sacrifice. And if we look at what the world looks at, the world looks at what we give. And what's God look at? God looks at what we don't give and what it says about our hearts. So in Luke 21:1-4, we see the widow put in all she has to live on. Jesus celebrates, right? Jesus celebrates. Why? Because she shows her dependence on God. She shows where her trust is placed. So the only kind of giving that Jesus celebrates is sacrificial. So is your giving sacrificial? Number 7, shift number 7, you ready? Is to go from guilt to grace. Charitable giving flows not from like pressure, but from willing hearts. I love 2 Corinthians 8, where Paul says, I want you to know about the grace that God's given the Macedonians. Grace. When God's grace is at work in our lives, it causes us to do unthinkable things. That is, be this conduit of material and spiritual blessing, right? And so this isn't about guilt, like, hey, you haven't paid your tithe, as if it's like a tax. And by the way, I don't use tithe language, and you won't find tithe language in the early church. Do you know why? It's law language. It sent me back to slavery. Prideful, tithing, thinking that the other 90% was mine. Get rid of that way of thinking. Everything belongs to God. Jesus says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. Everything is God's. So if everything we have has been given to us by the grace of God, we get to give to others by that same grace. And I pray that it starts working in your life even now as I'm talking. Shift number 8 is from obligation to opportunity. Obligation to opportunity. Now, I love this, that in Galatians 6:10, Jesus says to his people, Paul says to the Galatians, he says, I want you to do good to all people, especially those that are in the community of faith. In other words, take good care of the flock, and then do good to all. Make the most of every opportunity to do good to all. Now, what does that look like? I point people to the Good Samaritan, and this will shift you from obligation to opportunity. In the Good Samaritan didn't give a handout that created a dependency. He gave a hand up that built a disciple, because how he helped that person will help others, which is making the most of the opportunity to get this person back on their feet. Shift number 9 is from sporadic to standards. Sporadic to standards. Let me explain. In 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4, Paul's sitting in Ephesus, and he says, as I directed all the churches in Galatia, so also I'm directing you over in Corinth. What's the point? Our giving should look the same in every country as followers of Christ, a consistent witness. And what does he say? Set aside whatever extra you earn. In other words, live simply so you can give generously, right? And he even says he wants people approved with letters to carry the money. That means basically credentialed people. So when we say we follow standards, in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, we see even financial controls, like they have multiple people carrying the money. And so by following standards, it says, hey, let's do what's right before God and man in how we're managing generosity. When you do this, Paul did it to build confidence to participate in the collection. This is what we get to do to build confidence. We get to follow standards, not sporadically manage generosity and financial giving, but follow standards encouraging everyone to reflect a consistent witness. And then lastly, number 10, shift from the earthly to the eternal. In other words, to have this mindset that as a disciple of Jesus Christ, how can I use all I am and all I have, not for this life, but for the life to come? And it's really Colossians 3:2, setting our focus on things above, not on earthly things. And there's an expression, I think Randy Alcorn said it, our heart always goes where we put God's money. So if we put God's money and store it up in heaven through giving, through generous giving, our heart follows, because our heart goes to the things God cares about. And so I like to remind people, as C.S. Lewis said, if you aim at heaven, you get earth thrown in. If you aim at earth, you get neither. And so the best way we can focus on using our giftedness and our resources in this life is to use them in light of eternity. And so let's review the shifts we've made today. Number 1, shift from law to love. You don't have to give, you get to give. Number 2, shift from merit to mercy. 3, from favoritism to fairness. 4, from percentage giving, it's a tough one, to proportionate giving. 5, from dependency to distributor. 6, from surplus to sacrifice. 7, from guilt to grace. 8, from obligation to making the most of every opportunity. 9, sporadic to standards. And number 10, from the earthly to the eternal. And so my prayer and belief is if your church focuses on making these shifts, and you talk about what you're learning in the process, you're going to see all heaven break loose in your church. And you're going to see generosity, which is the fruit of the Spirit at work in you, move you beyond cultural patterns to Christian practices in a way that glorifies God. People will see your good works and they'll glorify the Father in heaven.